Thank you. Could I thank the contributors and two in particular contributions I wanted to single out: Nick Radford, John Slee, very able younger candidates with real insights as to what this crisis has actually meant for a younger generation. And there's a balance, because there are some of us around who represent an older generation, and Joyce Aram was one and I'm another, who've seen all this before. I mean, I bought my first house at the peak, not of the last boom, but the one before that. I learned what negative equity meant in the early 1970s. And there is a lesson in all of this, that indeed from the 18th century, we've had booms and bust cycles in investment and housing. Prices go up, they go down. And yet every generation of bankers and every generation of government ministers never understands that prices don't go up forever and ever. There is always a correction. And as a result, we've had this quite extraordinary housing policy, which my colleague Martin Horwood brilliantly described, this belief that prices will rise forever. The only solution to it is to build millions of new houses, concrete over Cheltenham, Dorset and elsewhere. These houses are now being built and there's no demand for them. And the origins of this problem lie primarily in the behaviour of credit institutions. A burst of reckless lending, banks lending at 5 or 6 times people's income, 125% of the value of people's homes, not just by Northern Rock, by some of the other more reputable banks as well. And that market is now collapsing. Now, the amendment to this motion does address that problem. I give it that credit, and it does understand that many of the problems lie within the banking system. But just reflect briefly on the implications of what James and Neil's amendment would mean. What they're in fact suggesting is putting a tax on bank lending. Now, what would a tax on bank lending do in the current circumstances of a credit crunch? Now, it is exactly the wrong time to introduce a measure of that kind. What has to happen is that the regulation of the banks has to offset the cycles in the economy, and that's now widely understood. But a measure of this kind, a rather fundamentalist approach, which takes no account of cycles in the market, is exactly the wrong way of doing it. And I do strongly recommend you reject that amendment that would seriously undermine our credibility. Now, there is one real sense in which there is a problem, a serious problem of housing supply, and that's in relation to affordable social housing. We've had the steady attrition of the stock of social housing under the right to buy policy, and we've had this new problem, which Julia very well described in her introduction, where much new affordable housing is linked to private development through Section 106 agreements, and as that development grinds to a halt, the social housing is stopped with it. And some of our councils in the past have been extremely imaginative in using this technique. South Shropshire, Heather's council was probably the best in the country. But you can't do that if development isn't happening. And that's why it's extremely important we take advantage of this situation to acquire surplus land and social property, use the pipeline of funding which is already available from the government to enhance the social housing stock. She's quite right. You can't do this indiscriminately. There's no point just buying up property, which may be totally inappropriate for families. That's why we emphasise the acquisition of land. One final point I want to emphasise is topical. Yesterday, the link between the crisis in the housing market, the crisis in the banking system. Last year we had Northern Rock. You know what happened, you know the position we took. When I advocated nationalisation, I was, I think, regarded by many people as some kind of closet Marxist. But any doubts on that score, I hope, were laid to rest a few weeks ago when George Bush, who I don't think anybody would be suspect of being a closet Marxist, effectively nationalised the whole of the American mortgage lending business. And this crisis is rumbling on. Yesterday there was a collapse in the value of the shares of HBOS, much of it triggered by short selling, by speculative behaviour by hedge funds. And why that is dangerous is that the hedge funds are speculating against the taxpayer. And that's got to stop. Just to conclude, we have a raft of measures here, practical economic measures, compassionate measures for helping people faced with repossession, and I hope you'll endorse